For 31 days, in the autumn of 1878, two counties in southern Colorado lived under a shadow, not the shadow of an army or a gang, but of a single man. A man who moved like smoke through the high country, who struck without pattern or warning, who seemed to know what the law would do before the law knew itself. Towns locked their doors at dusk, merchants slept with rifles, sheriffs from two jurisdictions rode themselves ragged chasing rumors and dust. And when it ended, when the threat finally lifted, nobody could quite agree on what they had been so afraid of, or whether the man they feared had ever been the monster they imagined. Something about those 31 days never sat right with the people who lived through them. Something about the way it all unfolded suggested that the truth was stranger and sadder than the legend that followed. The story begins not with violence, but with absence. On the morning of September 3rd, a Wednesday, the eastbound stage from Broken Bow to Silver Hill failed to arrive. The stage was never late. It carried mail, bank transfers, and passengers who had schedules to keep. By noon, the station agent in Silver Hill had sent a rider back along the route. By evening, that rider had returned with a pale face and few words. The stage had been found 8 miles out, standing empty in the middle of the rutted road. The horses were still in harness, calm and unbothered. The driver and the shotgun guard were gone. So were the 3 passengers. The strongbox had been opened, but not with tools. The lock had been shot clean through with a single bullet. Inside, nothing remained but papers scattered by the wind. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away that made any sense. Just a confusion of boot prints that circled the coach and then seemed to vanish into the scrub. The county sheriff, a man named Dalton Reeves, rode out that night with 6 deputies. They searched by torchlight and found nothing. At dawn, they widened the search. Still nothing. It was as if 6 human beings had simply stepped off the edge of the earth. By the second day, rumors were already spreading. By the third, panic had taken root in both counties like a fever. Broken Bow was a town born of silver and sustained by stubbornness. It sat in a shallow valley where the Spanish peaks rose like broken teeth against the western sky. 2,000 souls called it home, most of them tied to the mines or the railroad or the cattle trade that moved through the stockyards on the south end of town. It was not a gentle place. Violence was common enough, the kind that came with whiskey and wounded pride, and men far from anything that might civilize them. But it was a known violence, predictable, contained. This was different. This felt like something had shifted in the world, like a door had opened that should have stayed shut. Dalton Reeves had been sheriff for 11 years. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with grey creeping into his beard and a limp from an old bullet wound that troubled him in cold weather. He was not a man given to fear or superstition, but he felt both now, creeping at the edges of his thoughts. He had seen men killed over cards, over women, over imagined slights. He had tracked rustlers into the high country and brought back murderers in irons, but he had never seen anything like this. 6 people gone without a trace, no bodies, no ransom, no explanation. On the 4th day, a body was found, not one of the missing. A drifter, a man nobody knew, discovered by a ranch hand in a dry wash 5 miles north of town. He had been shot once, through the heart, and his pockets were turned out. No identification, no horse nearby. Just a dead man in the dust, and pinned to his shirt with a long thorn from a honey locust tree. A scrap of paper with 5 words written in careful script. This is just the beginning. Reeves stood over the body in the late afternoon light and felt the world narrow around him. The handwriting was educated, the letters formed with precision. This was not the work of some wild-eyed desperado. This was someone with intention, someone with a plan. He sent word to the sheriff in the neighboring county, a man named Hugh Garrity, and by evening they met in the dining room of the Silver Hill Hotel. Garrity was older than Reeves, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a voice like gravel and a reputation for ruthlessness. He had been a soldier once, and it showed in the way he carried himself, the way he assessed a situation with cold calculation. They spread a map across the table and marked the locations: the abandoned stage, the dead drifter, the towns and ranches scattered across 2 counties like seeds thrown on hard ground. "You think it's one man?" Garrity asked. "I don't know," Reeves said. "But that note suggests somebody wants us to think so, or wants us to be afraid. It's working." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the thing settling over them. 2 counties, thousands of square miles of mountains and high desert, canyons and pine forests, places where a man could vanish for years if he had the will and the skill. "We need to find those people from the stage," Garrity said finally. "Dead or alive, we need to know." But they never did. Over the next 10 days, 3 more incidents occurred. A supply wagon ambushed on the road to Cortez, the driver knocked unconscious, the cargo stolen. A homestead burned to the ground in the middle of the night, the family barely escaping with their lives. A mine payroll intercepted, 2 guards wounded but alive, left tied to a fence post with another note: "You cannot catch what you do not understand." Each time the pattern was the same: swift, efficient, no unnecessary violence, and each time witnesses reported the same thing. A single rider, dressed in dark clothes, face obscured by a bandana and a wide-brimmed hat. Tall, in the saddle, riding a grey horse that moved like a ghost. He spoke little. When he did, his voice was calm, almost polite. He never fired unless fired upon, and even then his shots were precise, meant to disable rather than kill. The newspapers picked up the story. The Silver Hill Gazette called him the Grey Rider. The Broken Bow Chronicle dubbed him the Phantom. People began to see him everywhere, in every shadow, every stranger who passed through town. Merchants closed early. Travellers avoided the roads after dark. Posses rode out and returned empty-handed, chasing reports that led nowhere. Reeves barely slept. He spent his days in the saddle and his nights studying maps, reading reports, trying to find the logic in it. There was always logic, even in madness. Men did things for reasons, even if those reasons made sense only to them. But this man, whoever he was, remained a cipher. On the 15th day, something changed. A young woman arrived in Broken Bow on the noon stage. She was perhaps 25, dressed in travelling clothes that had seen hard miles, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything. She checked into the boarding house on Pine Street and asked the proprietor if there was a sheriff in town. Reeves met her in his office an hour later. She introduced herself as Catherine Marsh, and she said she had information about the man they were looking for. "What kind of information?" Reeves asked. "The kind that might help you understand why he's doing this." "And how would you have that?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. Not fear, something closer to sorrow. "Because I know him," she said. "Or I did once, before the war changed him." Reeves leaned back in his chair. "Start at the beginning." And so she did. She told him about a man named Elias Crane, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had gone west after the war, looking for a new life like so many others. She had known him in Philadelphia before he enlisted. They had been engaged to be married. He had been kind, thoughtful, a man who loved books and believed in the possibility of a better world. But the war had taken that man and returned someone else. Someone haunted, someone who could not find peace in the ordinary rhythms of life. He had written to her once from Colorado 2 years ago, a brief letter telling her he was trying to start over, trying to forget. Then nothing, until 3 months ago, when she received another letter. This one was different, rambling, angry, full of accusations against men she did not know. He spoke of injustice, of corruption, of a system designed to crush men like him. He said he was going to make them see, make them understand. "I should have come sooner," she said quietly. "I thought he was just angry, that it would pass. But when I read about what was happening here, I knew." "Knew what?" "That he had finally broken." Reeves studied her. "Why would a schoolteacher become an outlaw?" "Because something happened to him here. Something that took whatever was left of the man I knew and destroyed it." "Do you know what?" "No, but I know he worked for a time at the mine outside Broken Bow. The Seraphim Lode, and I know he was let go under circumstances that were never clear." Reeves felt something click into place. The Seraphim Lode was owned by a man named Thaddeus Boone, a ruthless operator with interests in half the businesses in the county. If Crane had crossed Boone, that could explain a great deal. He rode out to the mine the next morning, Catherine Marsh beside him. She had insisted on coming, and he had not argued. Something in her determination reminded him of his own stubbornness, the refusal to let go of a thing until it was understood. The mine was a raw wound in the side of the mountain, surrounded by timber scaffolding and piles of tailings that glittered with fool's gold. The foreman was a thick-necked man named Cutler, who answered questions with the enthusiasm of a man being asked to dig his own grave. Yes, Crane had worked there. Yes, he had been dismissed. No, Cutler would not say why. When Reeves pressed, Cutler finally admitted that Crane had accused the mine owners of withholding wages from the workers, of doctoring the weight of ore to cheat them. Crane had been vocal about it. He had tried to organize the men. "Mr. Boone don't tolerate troublemakers," Cutler said flatly. "What happened to him?" Cutler shrugged. "He was encouraged to leave town, that's all I know." But Reeves could read between the words. Crane had been beaten, probably badly, run off, left with nothing but his anger and his sense of injustice. They rode back to town in silence. Catherine Marsh stared at the mountains, her face unreadable. "He was always drawn to lost causes," she said finally, "always convinced he could fix things, make them right. The war taught him he couldn't, and now this." "This isn't fixing anything," Reeves said. "It's just chaos. Maybe that's the point. Maybe he's trying to show you what it feels like to have your world turned upside down." That night, another robbery. This time, Thaddeus Boone's personal safe in his office above the bank. The Grey Rider had climbed through a second-story window, cracked the safe with practiced ease, and taken every dollar inside. He left behind a note addressed to Boone by name. "You built your fortune on broken backs. Now you will know what it is to have nothing." Boone was livid. He stormed into Reeves's office the next morning, red-faced and shouting, demanding action, demanding results. He offered a reward of $5,000 for the Grey Rider, dead or alive. By the 25th day, the situation had spiraled into something close to hysteria. Possess from both counties were riding in circles, chasing shadows. Innocent men were being questioned, accused, driven out of towns on suspicion alone. The railroads had increased security. The banks had hired private guards. And still, the Grey Rider continued his campaign, striking without pattern, always one step ahead. Reeves knew it could not go on. Something had to break. On the 28th day, he received a message. It was delivered to his office by a boy who said a stranger had paid him $1 to bring it. The note was simple. "If you want this to end, come alone to the old Fletcher ranch at sundown tomorrow. Tell no one. Come unarmed. We will talk." Reeves sat at his desk holding the paper, feeling the weight of the decision before him. It could be a trap. It probably was. But it was also the first time the Grey Rider had offered anything resembling communication. Catherine Marsh found him there an hour later. She read the note over his shoulder. "You can't go," she said. "I have to. He'll kill you. Maybe. Or maybe he just wants someone to listen." She sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Let me come with you." "No. He knows me. If he sees me, it might change things, or it might make it worse." They argued, but in the end she agreed to stay behind. Reeves spent the rest of the day putting his affairs in order, writing letters he hoped would never need to be read. The next evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, he rode out alone toward the old Fletcher ranch, a place abandoned years ago after a fire had claimed the main house. It sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by scrub oak and pine, the ruins of the house still visible, blackened beams reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some great dead beast. He arrived as the last light was fading. His horse moved nervously, sensing something. Reeves dismounted and walked forward, his hands visible, his holster empty as instructed. A figure stepped out from the shadow of the ruins, tall, dressed in dark clothes, the face still obscured by a bandana. He held a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. For a long moment neither man spoke, then the figure reached up and pulled down the bandana. The face beneath was younger than Reeves had expected, lean and hollow-eyed, with a beard that had grown wild. But it was a human face, weary and sad, not the face of a monster. "Sheriff Reeves," the man said quietly. His voice was hoarse, as if he had not used it much. "Elias Crane," Reeves replied. Crane nodded slowly. "I suppose Catherine found you. She's worried about you. She should have stayed away. She loves you." Crane flinched at the word, as if it caused him physical pain. "Love doesn't survive what I've become." Reeves took a careful step forward. "Then tell me what you've become. Help me understand." Crane looked at him, and in the fading light, Reeves saw a man at the edge of a precipice, deciding whether to step back or let go. "I came here to start over," Crane said, "to forget the war, to be the man I was before. But this place, this world, it's built on the same lies, the same cruelty. Men like Boone, they take and take and take, and nobody stops them. I tried to do it the right way. I tried to speak up, to organize, to fight within the system. And they beat me unconscious and left me in a ditch. They told me if I came back, they'd kill me. So you became what they said you were." "No," Crane's voice hardened. "I became what they needed to see. I became the thing that would make them afraid, make them understand that their power is an illusion, that one man with conviction can bring their whole rotten structure down. But it hasn't," Reeves said gently. "All you've done is hurt people who had nothing to do with Boone. Families, workers, travelers who were just trying to live their lives. Collateral damage," Crane said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Is that what you tell yourself? That the ends justify the means? I've heard that before. From soldiers, from outlaws, from every man who ever tried to remake the world in his own image. It never works, Crane. It only creates more pain." Crane's hand tightened on the rifle, and for a moment Reeves thought he had pushed too hard. But then Crane's shoulders sagged, and he lowered the weapon. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore." Reeves took another step forward. "Then let me help you." Behind him in the darkness there was a sound, the unmistakable click of a hammer being pulled back. Crane's eyes widened. "You brought someone." "No," Reeves said quickly. "I came alone." But even as he said it, he knew it was too late. Figures were emerging from the shadows around the ruins, 6 men, maybe more. And at the front, holding a pistol aimed at Crane's chest, was Thaddeus Boone. "Step aside, Sheriff," Boone said coldly. "This man is mine." Reeves turned, placing himself between Boone and Crane. "How did you know? I had you followed. Did you think I'd let you handle this alone? This isn't your jurisdiction." "I don't care about jurisdiction, I care about justice." "This isn't justice, it's revenge." Boone smiled, a thin and joyless thing. "Sometimes they're the same." Behind Reeves, Crane raised his rifle. And in the dying light, as the mountains turned to silhouettes against the burning sky, the tension that had gripped 2 counties for nearly a month crystallized into a single moment. A moment balanced on the edge of violence and tragedy, where choices made in anger and fear would determine who lived and who died, and whether any truth could be salvaged from the ruins of what had been. The hammer of Crane's rifle clicked back. Boone's finger tightened on the trigger. And Sheriff Dalton Reeves stood between them, unarmed and alone, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just this night, but everything that followed. Part 2. The Silence and the Hunt. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the valley, rolling through the darkness like thunder. When it faded, 3 men remained standing in the ruins of the Fletcher Ranch. Sheriff Dalton Reeves, unhurt but shaking, Thaddeus Boone, his pistol still raised. And behind Reeves, an empty space where Elias Crane had been standing a moment before. The Grey Rider had vanished into the night. Boone's men searched the surrounding area until dawn, their torches bobbing through the scrub like fireflies. They found nothing, no tracks that led anywhere meaningful, no blood, no sign of which direction Crane had fled. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. By sunrise, word had spread through both counties. The confrontation at the Fletcher Ranch became the subject of a dozen different stories, each one more dramatic than the last. Some said Crane had been wounded and was dying somewhere in the mountains. Others claimed he had accomplices waiting with horses, that he had planned his escape weeks in advance. A few whispered that he had never been there at all, that the whole thing was a ruse, a distraction while he struck somewhere else. But as the days passed and no new incidents occurred, a different kind of tension settled over the region. Not the sharp fear of an active threat, but something heavier and more persistent, the weight of not knowing, the anxiety of waiting for something that might never come. Sheriff Reeves returned to Broken Bow in disgrace. He had disobeyed orders, met with an outlaw alone, and let him escape. The town council called a meeting. There was talk of removing him from office. In the end, he kept his badge, but the trust that had sustained him for 11 years was damaged, perhaps permanently. Catherine Marsh left town 3 days after the incident at the Fletcher Ranch. Reeves spoke with her briefly before she boarded the eastbound stage. Her face was composed, but he could see the grief beneath the surface. "He's gone," she said quietly. "Not just from here, from everywhere. From himself." "People can come back from dark places," Reeves offered. "Not everyone." She looked out at the mountains, their peaks sharp against the morning sky. "Some people break in ways that can't be mended. The war taught me that. Elias taught me that. If he contacts you, he won't." She turned back to him, and her eyes were clear and certain. "Whatever he was, whoever he might have been, that person is already dead. What's left is just the echo." She climbed into the stage and was gone, and Reeves never saw her again. The search continued for another week. Pauses combed the high country, checking every abandoned mine, every line shack, every cave that might offer shelter. Sheriff Garrity brought in trackers, men who could read sign that others missed. They found places where someone had camped, evidence of fires hastily extinguished, scraps of food. But always the trail went cold, dissolved into stone or water or wind. On the 31st day after the first incident, the hunt was officially called off. There had been no new crimes, no sightings that could be verified. The general consensus was that Crane had either died in the wilderness or fled the territory entirely. The reward money remained unclaimed. Life, slowly and reluctantly, returned to something resembling normal, but normal was different now. The 31 days had changed things in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Merchants who had never locked their doors began doing so. Families who had lived on isolated homesteads moved closer to town. The stage lines hired extra guards. Trust, once freely given, became a commodity, carefully rationed, and people talked. In the saloons and general stores, around dinner tables and at church socials, the story of the Grey Rider was told and retold until it took on a life of its own, separate from the facts, shaped by fear and fascination in equal measure. Some said he had been a hero, striking back against the corruption of men like Boone. Others called him a madman, a product of the war's lingering poison. A few, usually after too much whiskey, claimed he had never existed at all, that he was a fiction created by someone else, a convenient scapegoat for crimes that had more mundane explanations. The one thing everyone agreed on was that they had lived through something that had touched them all, even those who had never seen the Grey Rider or lost anything to him. The very fact of his presence, or his presumed presence, had altered the rhythm of their days, had reminded them that the frontier was still wild, still dangerous, still capable of producing mysteries that defied easy resolution. Thaddeus Boone rebuilt his fortune. The money stolen from his safe was never recovered, but he absorbed the loss and moved forward, expanding his holdings, tightening his control over the mines and the men who worked them. If the experience had changed him, he never showed it. He remained as ruthless and calculating as ever, but there were whispers. Workers at the Seraphim Lode spoke of improvements in conditions, small concessions that Boone had never granted before. Better wages, safer equipment. It was never enough, and it was never acknowledged as connected to Elias Crane, but those who paid attention wondered if perhaps something had shifted, if the spectre of the Grey Rider had left a mark even on the hardest of men. Sheriff Reeves stayed in office, but the job wore on him in ways it never had before. He found himself watching strangers more carefully, questioning his own judgments, second-guessing decisions that once would have come automatically. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. His deputies noticed but said nothing. Men in his position were allowed their silences. Years passed. The story of the Grey Rider faded from immediate memory, became something that people mentioned occasionally but no longer dwelled on. Children who had been too young to remember grew up hearing it as a tale, half legend, half truth. New crises replaced old ones. Life, as it always does, moved forward. But there were still those who remembered. In the winter of 1881, a ranch hand named Tobias Grant was working a stretch of fence line in the high country west of Broken Bow when he found something strange. A camp, long abandoned, tucked into a narrow canyon where the wind rarely reached. There was a lean-to shelter built against the rock face, carefully constructed to be invisible from a distance. Inside, he found the remains of supplies, a blanket rotted by weather and time, and a book. The book was a volume of poetry, its pages swollen with moisture and stained by smoke. Inside the front cover, written in faded ink, was a name: Elias Crane. Grant brought the book to town and gave it to Sheriff Reeves. The sheriff sat in his office that evening, turning the pages carefully, reading the margins where someone had written notes in a cramped hand. Observations about the landscape, fragments of thoughts that suggested a mind turning inward, grappling with questions that had no answers. On the final page, a single sentence: "I have become the thing I fought against." Reeves closed the book and placed it in his desk drawer. He did not show it to anyone, did not report it. Some truths he had learned served no purpose beyond causing pain. In the spring of 1883, a prospector named Samuel Hicks claimed to have seen a man matching Crane's description in the mountains north of Cortez. The man had been gaunt, bearded, dressed in clothes that were little more than rags. He had been digging in the ground, looking for something, though Hicks could not say what. When Hicks called out to him, the man had looked up, stared for a long moment, then walked away into the trees without speaking. The story made its way through the saloons, but by then there had been dozens of such sightings, and no one took them seriously anymore. The Grey Rider had become a ghost story, something to spook children or entertain travelers who wanted a taste of frontier danger from a safe distance. In the autumn of 1885, a flash flood in the canyon where Tobias Grant had found the camp uncovered something else. A grave, shallow and unmarked, containing human remains. The bones were examined by the town doctor, who determined that they belonged to a man of average height, dead for several years. There was evidence of an old injury to the ribs, consistent with being beaten. But there was no way to know for certain who it was. Reeves attended the burial, held in the town cemetery on a grey morning when the first snow of winter was just beginning to fall. A handful of others came as well, though most could not have said exactly why. Perhaps it was closure, perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was simply the human need to mark endings, even uncertain ones. No name was carved on the stone, just the date and a single word: unknown. Life continued its forward motion. The railroad expanded, towns grew. The frontier, day by day, became less wild, more settled. The events of 1878 receded further into history, a story that old-timers told, but younger people barely knew. Sheriff Dalton Reeves retired in 1889. He moved to a small cabin outside of town and spent his remaining years in quiet solitude, tending a garden and reading books. He died in the spring of 1894, and among his possessions was the poetry book he had never returned to anyone, its pages now brittle with age. Thaddeus Boone died wealthy and respected in 1896. His funeral was attended by hundreds. His obituary in the Silver Hill Gazette made no mention of the Grey Rider or the events that had once held two counties in terror. The decades turned. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. The automobile replaced the horse. Telephones connected what distance had once separated. The world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to those who had lived through the autumn of 1878. But stories have a way of persisting, even when the people who lived them are gone. In the summer of 1952, a historian named Margaret Rees arrived in Broken Bow. She was researching a book about frontier justice and had come across references to the Grey Rider in old newspaper archives. The story intrigued her, not because of its drama, but because of its ambiguity, the way it refused to resolve cleanly into hero or villain. She spent 3 weeks in town, interviewing the few remaining people who had been alive in 1878, though most had been children then and remembered little. She examined county records, read through dusty files in the sheriff's office, pieced together a timeline from fragments. What she found was a story more complicated than the legend suggested. A man damaged by war and circumstance, driven to extremes by injustice, but unable to channel his rage into anything constructive. A community paralyzed by fear, but also complicit in the conditions that had created that fear. A system of law that was both protector and oppressor, depending on who wielded it. She published her findings in a modest academic journal in 1954. The article was titled "The Grey Rider: Violence and Vigilantism in Post-War Colorado." It received little attention outside of scholarly circles, but her research included something else, something she had not been able to confirm, but that troubled her enough to mention in a footnote. During her interviews, an elderly woman named Sarah Wickham, who had been a child in 1878, mentioned a story her father had told her. He had been a ranch hand, working land west of Silver Hill. In the winter of 1879, he claimed to have found a man living in a cave in the high country. The man had been sick, feverish, unable to care for himself. Wickham's father had brought him food and medicine, kept his presence secret, nursed him back to health over the course of several months. When spring came, the man had left. Wickham's father never saw him again, but before he went, the man had given him something. A letter, sealed, with instructions to deliver it to Catherine Marsh in Philadelphia if he ever had the opportunity. Wickham's father had kept the letter for years, unsure what to do with it. Eventually, it had been lost, or perhaps destroyed. Sarah Wickham could not remember, but she remembered her father's description of the man. Tall, hollow-eyed, with a sadness that seemed to fill the space around him, and she remembered the name her father had mentioned once, quietly, as if speaking it might summon something dark. Elias Crane. Margaret Rees included this story in her footnote with appropriate caveats. Unverified, second-hand, possibly apocryphal. But it lingered with her, this image of a man living out his final days in isolation, cared for by a stranger who owed him nothing, leaving behind a message that would never be delivered. She wondered what the letter had said, whether it was an apology or a justification or simply a goodbye. She wondered if Catherine Marsh had ever thought about him in the decades that followed, or if she had built a life that allowed no room for the memory of what he had been. These were questions without answers, and Rees was experienced enough to accept that. History was full of such gaps, spaces where the evidence ran out and imagination had to suffice. The best she could do was present what she knew and acknowledge what she could not prove. Her article was archived and forgotten, one more scholarly footnote in the vast catalogue of Western history. Decades passed. The cabin where Dalton Reeves had spent his final years collapsed in a windstorm in 1979. The remains were cleared away, and the land was sold to a developer who built a strip mall on the site. The Seraphim Lode was abandoned in the 1920s after the silver ran out. It became a tourist attraction in the 1960s, offering guided tours and a gift shop selling replica mining equipment. The guides told sanitized versions of the mine's history, emphasizing the adventurous spirit of the frontier and omitting the more uncomfortable truths about labor conditions and exploitation. Broken Bow itself survived, adapting to each new era. It became a regional hub for tourism, leveraging its proximity to the mountains and its historic downtown. Old buildings were preserved, turned into boutiques and restaurants. The past was commodified, made palatable, stripped of its complexity. In the spring of 2019, a construction crew was excavating a site on the north edge of town, preparing the foundation for a new medical center. 6 feet down, they struck something unexpected. Not rock or clay, but wood. Old wood, rotted but still intact enough to suggest structure. Work stopped. Archaeologists were called in. What they uncovered over the following weeks was the remains of a root cellar, probably dating to the late 1870s, that had been buried when the land was graded decades earlier. Inside, preserved by the dry climate and the protection of the earth, were artifacts from another time. Bottles and tools, scraps of leather, a rusted lantern. And in the corner, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the years, a bundle of papers. The documents were carefully extracted and brought to the County Historical Society. They included letters, receipts, a journal. The journal was small, leather-bound, its pages covered in the same careful handwriting that Sheriff Reeves had seen on the notes left by the Grey Rider. The entries covered a period of approximately 3 months, from December 1878 to February 1879. They described a man in hiding, grappling with illness and despair, cared for by someone he referred to only as the kind stranger. The writing was lucid at times, rambling at others, reflecting the fever that had nearly killed him. But what drew the most attention was the final entry, dated February 20th, 1879. I have decided to leave this place, not because I am healed, but because I understand now that some wounds are meant to be carried, not cured. I thought I could change the world through fear, could force men to see their own cruelty reflected back at them. But fear only breeds more fear, and cruelty more cruelty. The cycle is unbreakable by force. Catherine believed in a different way. She believed in patience, in the slow work of building something better rather than tearing down what is broken. I mocked her for that once, called her naive, but she was right, and I was wrong. I will not return to the world I left. That door is closed. But perhaps there is another path, quieter, less visible. Perhaps in the years I have remaining, I can find small ways to repay the kindness shown to me, to offer to others what the stranger offered to me. Not redemption, I do not believe in that anymore, but perhaps something like restitution. If anyone reads this, if these words survive when I do not, know that the Grey Rider died in that cave in the winter of 1878. What walked out in the spring was someone else. someone whose name and story are not worth recording. The journal was authenticated by experts. The handwriting was consistent with the notes from 1878. The paper and ink were correct for the period. There was no reason to doubt its authenticity. News of the discovery spread quickly. The story of the Grey Rider, dormant for more than a century, was suddenly alive again, the subject of articles and documentaries and debates. Had Elias Crane survived? Had he lived out his life in anonymity, performing small acts of kindness to balance the harm he had caused? Or had the journal been written as a final act of self-mythology, a way to control his legacy even from beyond the grave? The truth, as always, was elusive. But the journal ended with something else. Tucked between the final pages was a pressed flower, dried and fragile, its petals still faintly purple after all the years. And beneath it, in the same careful hand, a single line. For Catherine, who deserved better than the man I became. The flower and the words were placed on display at the County Historical Society, behind glass, labelled and explained. People came to see them, drawn by curiosity or sentiment or the simple human need to connect with stories that remind us of our own fragility. And somewhere in the high country west of Broken Bow, in places where the wilderness still resists human intrusion, there are those who claim to find signs. Cairns marking trails, shelters built for travelers caught in sudden storms, evidence of someone moving through the landscape, leaving help behind without signature or claim. Whether these are the remnants of Elias Crane's long atonement, or simply the work of others who share his impulse toward quiet reparation, no one can say. But the story persists, as stories do, evolving with each telling, refusing to settle into simple truth or comfortable fiction. Because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some shadows are cast too long by the light that created them. And some men, broken by their time and their choices, become neither heroes nor villains, but something in between, something human, flawed, and forever searching for a grace they will never quite reach. Part 3. The Truth and the Legacy. The photograph arrived at the County Historical Society in the autumn of 2021, 2 years after the discovery of the journal. It came in a padded envelope postmarked from Santa Fe, with no return address and no explanation beyond a single handwritten note on plain paper. I believe this belongs to your collection. My grandmother kept it all her life, but never explained why. Perhaps your research can make sense of it. The photograph was small, perhaps 3 inches by 4, printed on cardboard stock that had yellowed with age. The image showed a group of people standing in front of a wooden building. 7 figures, 3 women and 4 men, dressed in the simple clothes of working people from the late 19th century. The building behind them bore a hand-painted sign, too faded to read completely, though the words "school" and "mission" were visible. But it was one of the faces that caused the curator to call the director at home that evening, her voice unsteady with excitement or disbelief or something between the two. The man standing at the left edge of the photograph was tall and lean, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But what was visible matched the only known description of Elias Crane. The age was right. The build was right. And there was something in the way he stood, slightly apart from the others, as if he were present but not quite belonging, that suggested a man carrying weight the others could not see. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil in a hand different from the note, were 3 lines: Mission School, San Luis Valley, Spring 1887, EC, Teacher. The curator spent the next 3 months trying to trace the photograph's origins. The woman who had sent it, a librarian in Santa Fe named Elena Rodriguez, knew little about it beyond what she had written in her note. Her grandmother had died in 1998, taking her stories with her. The photograph had been found in a box of personal effects, tucked between the pages of a Bible, But the mission school could be traced. San Luis Valley, in southern Colorado, had been home to several such institutions in the 1880s, small operations run by various denominations to serve the children of settlers, miners, and indigenous families. Most had closed by the turn of the century, their records scattered or lost. Through persistence and luck, the curator found a reference in the archives of a church in Alamosa. A mission school had operated near the town of Jaroso from 1885 to 1891. The church records included a list of teachers who had served there, and among the names, written in faded ink, was one that stopped her breath. Elias Marsh. Not Crane. Marsh. Catherine's surname. The pieces began to assemble themselves, slowly, like a puzzle that had been scattered across decades. A man using the name of the woman he had once loved, perhaps as tribute, perhaps as penance. A man who had vanished from one life and constructed another, simpler and quieter, in a place where nobody knew what he had been. The curator published her findings in a regional history journal. The article was measured, careful not to claim certainty where none existed, but the evidence was compelling enough to generate attention. News outlets picked up the story. Documentaries were updated. The legend of the Grey Rider acquired a new chapter, one that complicated the narrative in ways that made it more human and therefore more troubling. Because if Elias Crane had indeed survived and lived another decade or more as a teacher in an obscure mission school, then everything that followed had to be reconsidered. The man who had terrorized 2 counties had not died in the wilderness, had not been consumed by his own darkness. He had walked away from it, had found a way to continue, had perhaps even found a measure of peace in work that served others rather than serving his rage. But there was no way to know what that life had been like. No journal entries from those years, no letters, just the photograph and the name in a church record and the implications they carried. The curator, a woman named Jennifer Hastings, became consumed by the mystery in the way that some people do when they encounter a story that refuses to release them. She took a leave of absence from her position and traveled to the San Luis Valley, driving the back roads, stopping in small towns to ask questions of local historians and elderly residents who might remember stories passed down through their families. What she found was fragments, a mention in someone's memoirs of a teacher who had been kind but distant, who never spoke of his past. A notation in a school report praising the progress of students under his instruction. A reference in a letter written by a minister to a colleague, describing a man who attended services faithfully but always sat in the back and never joined in fellowship afterward. And one piece of information that changed everything. In the county records office in Alamosa, buried in a file of death certificates from 1891, she found an entry for a man named Elias Marsh. Age at death, approximately 43. Cause pneumonia. Place, mission school near Jaroso. Burial, unmarked grave, school cemetery, next of kin, none listed. Jennifer sat in the records office for a long time after finding that entry, staring at the faded handwriting, feeling the weight of an ending that had occurred more than a century ago and was only now being acknowledged. She drove out to the site of the old mission school. It was gone, of course, reclaimed by the land. The valley stretched vast and empty, bounded by mountains that held the last snow of spring in their highest reaches. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. She walked the area for an hour, trying to imagine what it had looked like when the school stood there, when children played in the yard, and a haunted man tried to build something that might balance the harm he had caused. She found nothing that marked the spot. No foundations, no cemetery, just the land itself, patient and indifferent, keeping whatever secrets it held. That evening, in a motel room in Alamosa, she wrote the final section of what would become her book. She had not intended to write a book when she started, but the story had demanded it, had grown beyond the scope of an article or a report into something that required more space, more time, more careful consideration. The book was published in 2023 under the title The Grey Rider, A Frontier Reckoning. It was not a commercial success, but it found its audience among those who appreciated history, told with nuance and uncertainty, who understood that the most interesting stories are often the ones that resist simple conclusions. Jennifer's research was thorough, her writing measured. She presented the evidence without editorializing, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. But in the final chapter, she permitted herself a moment of reflection. "We want our outlaws to be monsters or heroes," she wrote. "We want them to be simple, to fit into categories that make sense, that allow us to judge them cleanly and move on." But Elias Crane was neither monster nor hero. He was a man damaged by war and circumstance, driven to extremes by injustice, but capable of recognizing his own complicity in the cycle of harm. He tried to remake himself, not once but twice, first into an instrument of fear, then into something quieter and perhaps more redemptive. Whether he succeeded in that second transformation, whether he found any peace in those final years teaching children in an isolated valley, we cannot know. But the fact that he tried suggests something about the human capacity for change and about the long shadow that trauma casts over even the strongest attempts at healing. The book sold modestly. It was reviewed in academic journals and regional newspapers. Some praised its careful research, others criticized it for being inconclusive, for raising more questions than it answered. But it had an effect beyond its immediate readership. In Broken Bow, the Historical Society created a new exhibit about the Grey Rider, one that incorporated Jennifer's research and attempted to present a more complete picture of the events of 1878 and their aftermath. The exhibit included copies of the journal entries, the photograph from the mission school, and artifacts from the period. It also included something else, a section devoted to the people whose lives had been touched by those 31 days. There were photographs of Sheriff Dalton Reeves in his later years, his face weathered and thoughtful. A brief biography of Catherine Marsh, pieced together from census records and city directories, revealing that she had never married, had worked as a seamstress in Philadelphia until her death in 1904. There was information about Thaddeus Boone and his business empire, but also about the workers at the Seraphim Lode, the families who had struggled under conditions that Elias Crane had tried to expose. The exhibit did not excuse what Crane had done, but it provided context, suggested that his actions had emerged from a world where power was distributed unfairly and justice was a luxury afforded only to those who could pay for it. The exhibit opened in the summer of 2024. It was well attended, particularly by visitors from out of town who had read Jennifer's book or seen one of the documentaries. But it also drew local residents, people whose great-grandparents had lived through the autumn of 1878, who had grown up hearing fragments of the story but never the whole of it. Among those visitors was a man named Thomas Wickham, 73 years old, retired from a career in education. He was the great-great-grandson of Sarah Wickham, the woman who had told Margaret Reese about her father's encounter with a man in a cave. Thomas spent an hour in the exhibit, reading every placard, studying every photograph. When he finished, he approached the curator and asked if he might speak with her privately. In her office, he told her a story. His family had kept something for generations, passed down from Sarah Wickham to her daughter, and finally to him. It was a letter, sealed in wax, yellowed with age. The envelope bore no address, just a name written in careful script, Catherine Marsh. "My great-great-grandmother's father was supposed to deliver it," Thomas explained, "but he never had the opportunity. He kept it, thinking someday he might. When he died, it passed to his daughter, and she kept it for the same reason. It's been in our family for almost 150 years. Nobody ever opened it. It felt wrong somehow, like it wasn't ours to read." He placed the letter on the curator's desk. But after seeing this exhibit, after reading about what you've learned, I think maybe it's time, not for us to read it, but for someone to decide what should be done with it." The curator stared at the letter, feeling the weight of history pressing down on the moment. "Have you considered opening it? Every day for the last 30 years since my mother gave it to me. But I always stopped myself. It was written for someone specific, someone who never received it. Opening it feels like a violation of something. Catherine Marsh is long dead. Everyone involved in this story is gone." "I know." Thomas was quiet for a moment. But knowing and feeling are different things. They sat in silence, the letter between them, a sealed communication from one century to another, carrying words that had never reached their intended recipient, and now never would. "If we open it," the curator said slowly, "it becomes public, part of the historical record. Is that what you want?" Thomas considered. "I think it's what it needs to be. Secrets don't serve anyone once everyone who held them is gone. Maybe the letter has something to teach us. Or maybe it's just a goodbye from a broken man to a woman who loved him. Either way, it deserves to be known." The opening of the letter was done carefully, with proper archival procedures. A conservator was brought in to ensure the paper would not be damaged. Photographs were taken at each stage. When the envelope was finally opened and the contents revealed, there were 3 people present: the curator, Thomas Wickham, and Jennifer Hastings, who had been contacted and had driven from Santa Fe to be there. The letter was short, written on a single sheet of paper in the same handwriting that had been identified as Elias Crane's. "My dearest Catherine, I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect anything from you at all. You made your peace with my disappearance long ago, and I have no right to disturb that peace, even with words you will likely never read. But I need to write this, if only for myself, to put into words the understanding that came too late to save what we had, or to save the man I was when you knew me. You were right about everything, about the war, about what it would do to me, about the impossibility of healing through vengeance. I did not listen, and the result was exactly what you predicted. I became the thing I hated. I hurt people who did not deserve to be hurt. I used justice as an excuse for cruelty and convinced myself that I was righteous. By the time I understood my mistake, it was too late to undo the harm. All I could do was walk away from that life and try to build something else, something smaller, quieter, something that might, over time, tip the balance back toward the light. I've found work teaching children in a place so remote that nobody asks questions about where I came from. It is not redemption. I know that. But it is honest work, and the children deserve better than they have been given by this hard world. If I can offer them even a small measure of knowledge and kindness, perhaps that is enough. I think of you often. I imagine the life you have built without me. I hope it is a good life, filled with the peace and stability I could never have provided. You deserved better than the man I became. You deserved better than the man I was, even before the war, if I am honest. You deserved someone whole. But I want you to know that you were the best part of my life, the part that was untouched by violence and fear, the part that reminded me what it meant to be human. I have carried that with me through everything that followed, and I carry it still. If there is any grace in this world, if there is any accounting beyond what we make for ourselves, then perhaps someday I will have the chance to tell you this in person. But I do not believe in that kind of grace anymore. I believe we get one life, and we either do what we can with it or we waste it. I wasted much of mine. But in the years I have left, I will try to make the waste mean something. Be well, Catherine. Be happy. And if you ever think of me, think not of the outlaw or the teacher, but of the young man in Philadelphia who loved you before the world taught him to be afraid. Always, Elias. The 3 people in the room stood in silence after the conservator finished reading the letter aloud. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what they had just heard. Finally, Jennifer spoke, her voice quiet. It doesn't change what he did. No, the curator agreed, but it helps us understand why. Thomas Wickham wiped at his eyes. My great-great-grandmother's father kept this safe for his whole life, hoping to give it to the woman it was meant for. He never got the chance. But maybe in a way we just did. Maybe that's enough. The letter was added to the exhibit, displayed alongside the journal entries and the photograph. It became the centerpiece of the collection, the thing that people stood in front of the longest, reading and rereading, each person bringing their own interpretation, their own feelings about what it meant. Some saw it as the confession of a man seeking absolution. Others read it as a farewell, a closing of accounts. A few dismissed it as self-serving, the final act of a man trying to control his legacy. But most people simply saw it as human, the words of someone who had made terrible mistakes and had tried, in his limited way, to acknowledge them. It was not enough. It could never be enough, but it was what he had been able to offer. Time continued its patient work. The exhibit remained popular for several years, then settled into the steady rhythm of local history. School groups visited, tourists stopped by. Occasionally, someone would leave a note in the comment book, sharing their thoughts, their own stories of family members who had lived through the period, their reflections on justice and redemption and the weight of the past. Jennifer Hastings wrote other books, but none captured her attention quite the way the story of Elias Crane had. She remained in contact with the Broken Bow Historical Society, occasionally contributing articles or speaking at events. She never stopped wondering about the mission school, about what Crane's life had been like in those final years, about whether he had found any measure of peace. Thomas Wickham donated his family's papers to the Historical Society, including letters and diaries that added small details to the larger story. He felt lighter afterward, as if he had been carrying something without realizing it and had finally set it down. The land itself, indifferent to human stories, continued to shape and reshape itself. The mountains held their snow, the valleys filled with grass that turned gold in autumn. The places where Elias Crane had hidden, where he had lived, where he had died, remained unmarked and unknown, absorbed back into the wilderness that had sheltered him. But the story persisted. Not because it was dramatic or because it offered clear moral lessons, but because it was true in the way that complicated stories are true. It reflected something about the time and place that produced it, something about what happens to people when they are pushed beyond their capacity to endure, something about the long and uncertain path back from darkness. On a spring evening in 2029, a woman named Rachel Boone stood in the Broken Bow Historical Society, reading the letter Elias Crane had written to Catherine Marsh. Rachel was a descendant of Thaddeus Boone, though the connection was distant enough that she had only learned of it recently while researching her family history. She had come to the exhibit with mixed feelings. The story of the Grey Rider had always been told in her family as a cautionary tale about the dangers of lawlessness, about the importance of order and authority. But standing here, reading the actual words of the man who had terrorized her ancestor, she found herself feeling something unexpected, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The recognition that everyone in the story, Crane, Boone, Reeves, Catherine, had been trapped in systems larger than themselves, had been trying to navigate a world that offered few good choices and many opportunities for harm. Her ancestor had built a fortune on the backs of workers he had exploited. Crane had tried to fight that exploitation and had become a monster in the process. Reeves had tried to maintain order in a world that was fundamentally disordered. Catherine had tried to love someone who could not be saved. None of them had been entirely right. None of them had been entirely wrong. They had simply been human, struggling with impossible circumstances, making choices that seemed necessary at the time, but that carried consequences none of them could have fully anticipated. Rachel left the exhibit that evening and drove out to the site of the old Seraphim Lode. The mine had been closed for decades, but the entrance was still visible, gated now, with warning signs about unstable ground. She stood at the fence and looked at the mountains scarred by the search for silver. And she thought about all the people who had labored here, whose names were not recorded, whose stories had been forgotten. She thought about the fact that her own comfortable life had been built in part on the foundation of their suffering. That the money that had sent her to college and allowed her to pursue a career she loved had originated here, in this dark hole in the earth, extracted by the sweat and pain of men whose descendants might be anywhere now, scattered across the country, carrying their own inherited griefs. There was no way to make that right, no way to go back and undo the harm. But standing here, acknowledging it, seemed important, seemed like a small but necessary act. She took a photograph of the mountain and the mine entrance, posted it to her social media with a brief caption about history and memory and the importance of understanding the full complexity of our stories. It received a modest number of likes and comments, most of them superficial. But a few people responded with their own stories, their own reflections on family histories that were more complicated than they had been taught. And in that way, the story continued to ripple outward, touching new people, generating new conversations, refusing to settle into comfortable myth. Because that is what true stories do. They resist simplification. They demand engagement. They change with each telling while remaining fundamentally themselves, rooted in events that actually occurred, but always open to new interpretation, new understanding. The sun set over the mountains west of Broken Bow, the light turning everything gold, and then purple, and then the deep blue of approaching night. The wind moved through the pines with its ancient sound. Somewhere in the high country, cairns marked trails and shelters stood ready for travelers who might never come. The land held its secrets the way land always does, patient and silent, waiting for the next person who might ask the right questions or simply sit quietly and listen to what the silence offers. And in that silence, if you listened carefully enough, you could almost hear it. Not answers. There were never any final answers, but something else. The echo of lives lived as best as could be managed in difficult times, the testimony of people who had struggled and failed and tried again. The reminder that justice is always incomplete, that redemption is always uncertain, and that the best we can do is acknowledge the complexity, honor the truth, and keep moving forward, carrying our stories like prayers or warnings or both, passing them down to those who come after, trusting that they will find in them whatever wisdom the times require. The stars emerged one by one over Colorado. The same stars that had watched the autumn of 1878, that had illuminated the flight of the Grey Rider and the grief of Catherine Marsh and the determination of Dalton Reeves. They offered no judgment, these stars. They simply witnessed, as they had witnessed countless other human stories, each one brief and burning and already fading into memory before the light had finished reaching across the vast and indifferent dark. And that, perhaps, was enough.